You know, the other day I mentioned that I had no idea how any of us dealt with the screens for something like the Game Boy Color or even the Game Boy Pocket or the regular Game Boy, because we didn't have any light. It was a screen that we had to rely on anything around us to provide light to it, and it was pretty tough to use. At least now. I mean, I guess back then we made it work. We even got those little worm arm lights because we wanted to play Pokemon and we figured out any way we could, right, to do it. But Nintendo must have heard us, because at one point they did produce a Game Boy that had its own light. Well, backlight. Backglow? It was an interesting design. It was Nintendo pretty much creating a product out of the Game Boy line, and they didn't want to spend, I guess, a ton of money to make it, so we got the Game Boy Light. Today, we'll talk about it and why it's a pretty big collector's piece for most people, and why it's pretty much the rarest piece in the Game Boy lineup. Now, the Game Boy Light was released in 1998 with the idea being, well, we're gonna light the screen up in some way, and they did. They used a panel that's an electroluminescent panel, one you may have seen before in like those digital watches where you would press a button and the screen would glow like blue or green. That's what they did here with this Game Boy. Now, this came out roughly 6 months or so before the Game Boy Color, and it was only in Japan. So if you want one now, you're most likely gonna be buying it on eBay, and it's probably from a seller in Japan. So it'll take a little while to get to you, and you may have to pay a little bit more for shipping, but this has become a pretty big collector's piece for a lot of people. And after getting one of these, I can see why. It's super unique, actually. It's an interesting cross between a Game Boy Color and a Game Boy Pocket, and while the screen isn't super bright because they went for more of a glow, it's very uniform. Like the actual lighting of the screen doesn't have like big patches of light from the bottom or the top to light the entire screen up. It just kind of glows and turns on. So if you do enjoy these videos with the Game Boy Light and other pieces, make sure you like the video on the way out. And let's start by taking a look at the front of the Game Boy Light. If we pull down a Game Boy Pocket right next to it, and then we grab a Game Boy Color on this side, we can see a bit of a size difference, right? Honestly, it's taller than the Color, and it's certainly taller than the Pocket, which is interesting. They had to do some rearranging inside, which may have lended to it basically having to grow a bit, but there is a massive difference between the Pocket and the Light, and that is in terms of the batteries that they use, which is something else that people figure kind of went into this enlarging of the system overall, because we can see on the back here, we have a spot for AA batteries, as they had to grow the back and that battery door, and then on this one, we have AAA batteries. In fact, if we open this up, you can see the door is hollowed out almost on the inside here, and then it kind of extends out here so that these AA's will fit. Now, if you look at it next to the Game Boy Color, it is closer. The Game Boy Color has more curves around the edges, whereas this has, of course, kind of the hard edge corner here, and then it curves off on this side with the speaker itself, but it is much more comparable to the dimensions of the Game Boy Color, especially once you turn it kind of sideways. You can see they both have kind of that curvature around where the AA batteries are, as opposed to the AAA batteries on the Pocket, which kind of just has a flat back there. And then if you look on the front, you can see that they had A and B kind of printed on the buttons, much like they did with the Game Boy Light and the Color, whereas with the Pocket, they just went ahead and printed them below it. And then you also on these kind of have these raisings of the start and select kind of symbols here, whereas this was essentially just kind of painted on there. And then you also have the raising of the Nintendo logo here, but it's actually depressed for this design. And I have to say, the Game Boy Light is much easier to hold than the Pocket, just because it is thicker and it does have that backing there, and it's overall taller. It just fits better in the hand to me, whereas the Game Boy Pocket's a bit more cramped. The Light is a bit more spread out and just easier to grip. Also, something else I really like is that they have the MGB 101 is the model number for the Light, and it's the MGB 001 on the Pocket, which reminds me very much of the SP being the AGS 101 and the 001, just something else that kind of got carried over with the model numbers. So let's talk a little bit about that electroluminescent panel here, and here's the issue with this panel. I think it is good when it is in like pitch black darkness. It needs to be very dark, I think, in the room for it to work, because when you turn it on, you have a switch up here that goes between off on and then light. They even have it printed right on the front here. So if you just kind of press it over a little bit, you'll get the screen itself turning on without the backlight. And it'll go about no problem. And you can then switch the light on, which is gonna be kind of hard unless I angle it this way where it's darker. And you can see that little bit kick on. Now, I can, of course, get some footage of it in the pitch black just so you can see the difference, but for the most part, it doesn't make a huge impact when it is in at least dimly lit room. It really doesn't. It's a bit harder to notice the difference, but if you were someone who was struggling with your Game Boy because you were frequently using it at night, then the Gameboy Light worked. I'm not really a fan of the top switch controlling the power on and off, and then the screen as well. I think the screen on and off would have done better to be kind of its own switch, maybe on the side somewhere, or even a button on the front, mostly because I could see someone maybe wanting to turn kind of the glowing screen off, but keep the system on, and then accidentally flipping the switch all the way to the side, completely turning the system off. So you might not be able to save your game in time, obviously, if you just flip that off. It was kind of a strange decision that I still don't really get. Now, I do want to show you one interesting thing. So this is with the Electroluminescent panel on right now. So it is technically lit up. And something that's pretty neat is there is no like bleeding or backlight bleed anywhere around the edges because it is one solid panel behind it that is lighting up, much like I said, those watch faces that you would have. This is a backlit pocket that was modded. We did that here on the channel. And if I power that on, it's significantly brighter, but you can easily see some backlight bleed here where the light emits from. And it is noticeable even looking at the front, of course, because this bottom will be lit up pretty heavily. It is better in where it's very bright, but I like the uniform light approach here. So in the dark, this honestly would probably be easier on your eyes than this. Speaker still sounds really, really good with this, although I am a little strange with the pockets placement and the lights, just because you tend to kind of cover the speaker grill up when you're playing. But otherwise, yeah, this one's in pretty good shape, to be honest. For all things considered, with the way it came stock with the battery door and everything, I think it's pretty good. So now we're gonna open up the Gameboy Light, and I wanted to talk about a few things with it. It seems that they used a lot of parts from the Game Boy Pocket and modified them slightly for this to work, which is smart. They weren't looking to do a massive production run of this. Obviously, it wasn't released in the US or anywhere else in the world outside of Japan. So of course they would want to repurpose some of the Game Boy Pocket boards to make this work, and they did. And the way that they managed to get the light in there is kind of interesting. So naturally they use their tri-tipped screws because why not? This is Nintendo, you always deal with this from the 90s. But this, much like the Pocket, or really any Game Boy at the time, was pretty easy to take apart. There's pretty much just a few screws on the back, and then it pops off, and we can look right at the board. Now, a quick look inside, it's very familiar looking to like the Game Boy Pocket. We have our big old CPU chip there, and some of the screws are moved around. Now, the reason for that appears to be a different component on the other side that made them rearrange some of the screw placements, and we can take a look at that in a minute, which I can only assume is from them adding that EL light on the other side here. All right, so we had 4 screws on the board, all Phillips head, and this guy just pops right off of there. Now, this is the component here that I'm talking about, and this is different from the Pocket. This is not in the Pocket at all, so I can only assume it relates to power management for that backlight in some way. And you can see they had to move some things around because in the Pocket, you would have normally had a screw going like through the dead center right here. They couldn't do that with this component, and it does rest like right between where these buttons are. You can even see they had to hollow out some of the plastic just to make sure that it fit correctly. But otherwise, looking over this, like I said, it's just a very similar board. It's pretty much the same one that's in the Pocket, but they did have to add something, and that has to do with these contacts right here. You see those 2 little copper points? Well, that is how they managed to transfer power to the panel for the backlight, and they did it by just having it press up against it. Seriously, the panel itself is not soldered to the board. It's not plugged in. It uses pressure in order to light the backlight up, which we can see here. So the way this works, they have a little piece of rubber behind it, and that way it can kind of conform a bit to the board, have some pressure, while also being able to change kind of shape if it needs to, depending on the angle that it's being screwed in with. But For the most part, it will provide pressure, and then it will have a current that goes through and then produces that glow that you get from these EL lights, and we can actually take it out of here. So this is the cool thing. The light itself, this guy, is not attached to the screen at all. Like, this will light up. It has like this green glow to it on this side, and once these press up against that board and then power is provided, you'll just have this nice green glow to it. It doesn't get super bright, as I mentioned, but because it is just one panel rather than a series of lights at the bottom that then project light up, you don't get any of that LED bleed or kind of that spotlight effect. This whole panel just kind of produces a glow that is probably easier on the eyes, and to be honest, for some people, might make the picture look a bit better. In fact, I've seen some people online install these in just Game Boy Pockets because they would rather have this rather than like an aftermarket LED setup like those backlights for the Pocket, because they thought it was just too strong. It's just too bright, whereas this is just more subtle, but it still gets the job done. Now, we talked earlier a little bit about these AA batteries and how they upgraded from the AAA batteries to the AA batteries, and that actually makes a lot of sense considering Nintendo's biggest advantages over its competitors with the Game Boy were three things. It was price, it was battery life, and it was Pokemon. But they definitely didn't want to lose out on the battery life, so they upgrade to two AA batteries rather than AAA batteries, so that this screen, or this backlight for the screen, wouldn't actually rob you of any battery life, technically. In fact, if you have this on with the light, it's about 12 hours from what people have gathered online. I haven't run like a full benchmark test myself. And then if you have the light off, you will actually gain battery life to about 20 hours. And pretty much over the Game Gear, which the Game Gear still had a full color backlit screen, this was still pretty good if you think about how many AA's went into that Game Gear for 2 to 3 hours, and this would use 2 AA's for a back glowing screen, we'll say, at 12 hours. And ladies and gentlemen, that's gonna do it here for the Game Boy Light. It took all the way until 2005 for Nintendo to produce another backlit screen in one of their gaming handhelds, and that was with the SP AGS 101, and that was a fully colored backlit screen, and it looked amazing. But this was a pretty cool thing to see pop up in 1998, where we had a Game Boy that had a screen that technically glowed and worked well enough in like a pitch black room while still having better battery life than the Game Boy Pocket at the time. So I think it's kind of a neat handheld, and if you're someone who's been thinking about grabbing one of these for the collection, I actually believe that it's easier to use than even the Pocket. So yeah, it might be worth checking out, especially if you're someone who just wants, I guess, this form factor, but don't want to buy like a modded system or a modded handheld. I mean, this is all first party from Nintendo, and it's a backlit Game Boy. Thanks guys for watching. Let me know what you think about the Game Boy Light down below. Make sure you like the video on the way out if you enjoyed it, dislike it if not, and get subscribed if you enjoy seeing teardowns on these weird and definitely obscure systems. I'll see you guys next time.